I see the TV is all ready, and so I've got 4 o'clock. I'll call the meeting to order. This is a policy committee meeting of the West Bend Joint School District Number 1 School Board, and it's May 20th at 4 o'clock. And I can confirm this meeting was properly posted because I took a look at the posting on Monday and the agenda and everything. So I don't know if Google updated their WebEx, but it's pretty cool. I can see everybody's face on one screen this time, so that's neat. I see from the policy committee, Chris Swigert and Paul Fisher and Aaron Dove, school board members joining today. And Jen Roush is on the line, Superintendent Don Kierkegaard, Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning, Laura Jackson, Director of IT Technology, Tim Harder, and Principal from the high school, Ralph Schloss. Am I missing anybody else for the roll call there? If not, we've got a couple of policies and then some exhibits to review related to co-curricular activities, and another policy as it relates to the virtual attendance at board meetings, and then we'll discuss our policy review schedule at the end. And so we'll start with revised board policy 370, co-curricular activities.
Yes, so co-curricular activities actually are available to our elementary students all the way through our high school students. We tend to think of that mostly for high school, but the policy is written really to be across all levels. And as you look at the policy that in the agenda link is posted as co-curricular activities 370, you will see that it has the original on the top with strike-throughs. There is a green section. That green section is green because it's in the current policy, but it's moved down into what we're proposing for the new policy. So when you turn to page 2 and the red section begins, that is what we're proposing as the new policy. That same paragraph that was green above is green down below, but it's not struck through. It remained green because that's part of the original current policy. The remainder of what is in red is right from the WASB recommended policies. We spent some time discussing this with principals from the intermediate through high school level, and all principals were invited to comment on it as well. And we spent a lot of time talking about the policy and have come to the conclusion that this is where the administration would recommend the board consider going with this policy.
Cool. Any, for people who reviewed it on the school district side, any concerns or questions, comments related to the policy? Or I guess I see you shaking your head no. Any board members that have had a chance to take a look at this, see any issues with it? That section that is in green, I know that's in our current policy, and it talks about how parents have a right to be informed of what their children are participating in. That's pretty common, I would assume, throughout.
The statement about that parents / legal guardians shall provide informed written consent for each co-curricular activity before a student may participate. That's not in that wording typical. To need to provide for all co-curriculars informed written consent. So if someone wanted to join the chess club, they don't always have to have written consent for that in other places. And we don't currently have a chess club right now. And we don't have, and I mean, that's a club that sometimes you have at the elementary, middle, high, all the way through, but we don't currently have informed written consent for that.
And it's no problem, this process of getting consent. I mean, if a kid wants to join student council, does student council have a form to provide the kid to take home to have mom and dad sign?
Yeah, they take home a form that would parents what they're going to be doing. And, and part of the reason we do it, Joel, is so parents know where their children are after school on any given, they know the schedule. And then we track it in Family ID. We take attendance for students in these co-curriculars because at the end of any given season, they can earn letters or numerals depending on the co-curricular. So it's just a nice means of tracking things. And we've had people in the past go, hey, I know my son or daughter is in a meeting right now with Key Club, and could you go get them for me? There's an emergency. So it's just another way for us to communicate with families where their children are after the school day is done.
I think having the written consent, I understand it, I think it makes sense. But just to explore it a little bit further, let me flip the question over. And do you think there are children who would participate in co-curricular activities, but somehow this is creating some sort of barrier for them to attend? That makes sense?
That does make sense. I think that some of our clubs that exist for the support of students and sometimes, like we have a saga club at the high school, students may not yet be ready to discuss that outside with anybody and maybe looking to participate in that so they have some support. Potentially with that particular club, and it may prevent a student from participating.
Just goes to show with every statement there are advantages and disadvantages. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments about the policy as proposed?
None from me. Anybody else? Aaron, Paul, Chris?
None here.
I don't have any.
Great.
I'm good.
And Laura, as we move through the agenda, then the next agenda items 2, 3, and 4 are currently ARs, correct? And we're now turning these into exhibits?
It's actually written both ways in our current listing of policies. So I think we just need to clarify that. Can I back up just 1 second?
Yep.
Are the board members good to take the policy to the first reading?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
I want to also add just one more piece. The other reason too that it's nice to get that parent signature. Like I said, we're taking attendance, but every few years we audit our co-curriculars to see. We used to have chess club. Well, it dropped off the level of interest, and we could track it over time how many kids were in the activity. It's just another layer of just keeping track of that kind of data, if you will. And then because there were certain co-curriculars that no longer had or held the interest for students or had a lot of students in them, we went out to the student body and we asked them, what would you like to see your schools have? And as a result of that, we started things like underwater ROV and different, started Interact and other clubs or co-curriculars, I should say.
Cool. Yeah, that's great.
So the next 3 items are listed as it's listed as AR Exhibit A, and they're all listed as with AR at the start of it. Moving forward, I would propose just to take the AR off and just call it Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C. But they are not currently referenced in the policy as exhibits. So it realistically could go either way, whichever the board would desire. For the purposes of this, I took off the AR reference to it.
And Laura, for being the new kid on the block, I'm assuming AR administrative rule in capitals has some weightiness to it. Can you give me some perspective there?
So the AR exactly stands for administrative rule. once the policy is set by the board, sometimes it's necessary to put an AR into place in order to define how the administration is going to carry the policy out. So it's called the administrative rule, which sometimes typically provides more detail and more specificity for how the administration is carrying out the direction provided in the policy.
Okay, so a policy's created, that obviously comes through the board for approval. If an AR is needed, that's totally at administration's decision and is implemented without coming back through this body, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
So an exhibit is typically an exhibit of the policy. And when it's with the AR, it's typically just called a form. So it would be Form A, Form B, Form C, rather than an exhibit. And I'd like to go through them and then kind of make that call if we're going to move them on as exhibits of the policy, or if we're going to just rename them to be a form for the co-curriculars. Okay. So I'm going to do a little explanation overall and then come back to the individual items. So the way that they are listed on the website, A, B, and C, Part A is the application that you would fill out if you wanted to create a co-curricular. Part B is the process, like how a co-curricular gets to become in place. And then C is the criteria for if something's would be considered a co-curricular or not. In the new updated version of A, B, and C, A would be the procedure first, B would be the application, so those two would be switched, and then C would be the criteria. On the revised one for Exhibit A, it still at the top says school-sponsored co-curricular activity or club application. The word procedure will be added to the end should we go forward with the revision.
Laura, I noticed on that same page, 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of where it starts, once presented to the principal will review the application and return it for more information or bring the request to the administrative team. Noticed that this morning.
I'm glad that you did, thank you.
I think these exhibits look fine to me. I like the fact that you've got the procedure lined out in Exhibit A first, and then, like you said, the application type stuff goes through the next two. So I like the way that's laid out.
We, in the procedure, stated administrative team because we wanted there to be some flexibility in who that team would be comprised of based on the co-curricular and the grade level that it would be at.
Cool. Any questions on these three? And I'll admit I didn't read through all of B and C. I kind of glanced over, but before we move them on to the full board, let's just double check to make sure we didn't omit any grammatical words or phrases or whatever. But
I thought they looked fine. The one question that I had was, with regard to the application, because we attach this to a board policy, does that handicap us in the event there has to be some minor change made to the form, during the middle of the year? Otherwise, we'd have to come back to the policy committee. We'd have to amend it. We'd have to bring it forward to the board, even if we fast-tracked it. I'm not necessarily against that. I just want to be sure we understand that that's the side effect of this, so to speak.
You're absolutely correct. That would be the side effect. So we can change them to forms that are attached to the AR rather than an exhibit.
Well, there is no AR, is there?
There is, that is not yet revised.
Oh, okay, okay.
I guess I'm okay with it either way. I guess I'd go for the one that's a bit simpler. If we've got the overarching policy that's set, these exhibits can't be in conflict with that particular policy.
Correct.
So I guess, I might ask if administration has a recommendation one way or the other on, whether these should be exhibits or whether they should be forms, or I'm getting the language wrong, but
Yeah, that's
what's the administration's recommendation?
I would recommend not attaching them to the policy itself, but attaching them to the AR.
I think that makes sense, but I'm certainly up to, others' opinions too.
Well, I think it makes sense, and you don't need to bring them to the board then for approval.
I think we would have to just say we're removing the exhibit.
Okay,
And at the board meeting, it would have to be approval to remove the exhibit.
yeah,
And then we'd have to inform the rest of the board that they were going to be forms attached to the AR rather than exhibits of the policy.
yep,
And then, like we do, because when we remove a policy, we vote on that. We need to do that.
yep.
There's just a typo in Exhibit B, page 2 at the top. It says school-sponsored co-curricular.
Page B at the top. Oh, yeah. Look at
The
that.
heading on the table.
Thank you for that. We'll revise those and then indicate that there'll be forms in the future.
Great.
Just one more piece then, Laura, on the bottom of page 1 on Exhibit B, and maybe, I would assume we probably need to take a look at all three of these, but that italicized content there, the second to last sentence ends in identified in 370 Exhibit C. So I'm assuming all references to exhibits will be flipped to 370 Form C?
Correct.
Okay,
And that's also in A.
okay.
Good. Sounds like we know what we're doing with that one, Laura.
Thank you. The next one on the agenda is board policy, the current board policy 371. In looking at WASB, they don't have a specific 371. They do have a 371.1 that's really about the development of non-school sponsored student organizations. And my recommendation, and I spoke with Mr. Schloss about this, is that we remove this policy at period, because it does contain multiple things that perhaps can be connected differently in a more meaningful way in the future.
Yeah, I read through this one this morning, and again, it's kind of one of those policies that has been around for decades, and there's really not a lot of meat to it anymore. So, I'm fine with deleting this one. I think the student handbook was probably the most important, I guess, part of this policy, but we have and publish student handbooks every year at the school, so.
And I do believe that that is actually covered in another policy that states that the schools will have a handbook for their families.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or opinions on this? Aaron, before I ask about moving this one forward, I love having you here. You're always welcome at the policy, but when I ask about moving these forward to the board, don't if I could ask you to refrain from giving us your opinion, because otherwise we create a quorum with nodding heads or not, so.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on this one? Are we okay moving, Chris and Paul, are we okay moving this into the?
Paul's okay.
Chris is okay.
Okay, great. Virtual attendance at board meetings.
Yeah, so this policy was recently revised and created, and given where we are, it's we said in the board meeting that it would be revisited by the policy committee at a future date. Tim?
Yep, so I think Paul actually made the request that it come back to the entire committee to, in essence, hash out what we want this to permanently look like after COVID, or after the emergency order from the state. And so the question for the committee is do we want to keep the current policy as is and use this as our policy going forward for virtual attendance? Or are there recommendations or things that we have seen over the past month and a half, 2 months of doing this that the board would like to change? I don't have anything necessarily specific that I would like to change. Just getting into the habit of the participation of board members shall only take place with the provisions. Now that we would potentially come in person, if Paul would need to, be from home for the meeting, we would want to follow that. It gives us the opportunity to know in advance so that we have time to set up the appropriate technology based upon the number of board members that are absent, or excuse me, that are attending virtually. And I appreciate the language in there, so that's my only piece of feedback.
Well, right. I think, what I bring this group's attention to is it's the bulk of the second paragraph where it says it's the policy of the district board members may participate in open and closed sessions of meetings, work sessions, et cetera, via video or teleconferencing if extenuating circumstances prevent the board member from being physically present, and then teleconferencing not allowed for annual meetings, et cetera. And I'd be curious this group's thoughts. Are we at a point where we would consider relaxing that, especially because of, now especially in this post-COVID-19 era, we may have a period of time where, yes, the law says that we can have in-person meetings, but perhaps someone's not comfortable coming to an in-person meeting. And do we want to say, well, too bad, because it says here that, that we don't necessarily consider that an extenuating circumstance, so you better show up. My opinion is I would be happy to do this, or Paul, maybe you and I, or Tim, we can look at this together. But my thought is that we take a look at it, because I think there's some wording. I'd like at least this group to consider some more flexibility in the policy, the way that it's written. But of course, I'm curious for others' thoughts.
No, I agree that if you've got an individual for health reasons, they're not comfortable, going out in person, does that, in essence, eliminate them from being on the board? I would deem that to be an extenuating circumstance for that individual. The other piece I'm curious about is in that same sentence earlier on. Board members may participate in open and closed sessions. Prior to all of this, we could not come in via dial-up for a closed session. Was that our own policy doing, or was that a state statute that has been relaxed because of all this and might revert back and stand in the way of anything we may choose to do regarding closed meetings ourselves?
Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, my understanding, and Joel, I think you're probably going the same places. It was our own policy that drove that. When we brought this policy forward, the idea is that we may need to have a closed session. We knew at that point we were looking to hire a superintendent, and it may be pertinent to be able to have closed sessions if they couldn't travel because of COVID or whatever else. I think when you get into closed session, the security side of it is the part of it that's really important. If you remember when we started this, we kind of shared out a little bit of a norms document of attending virtual meetings. In essence, kind of an AR, even though we don't reference an AR in the policy. The idea that, how do we know who's really sitting behind Paul when he's on camera? And the fact that when you're in a closed session, you can't turn your camera off. That is the reason why I believe the closed session is probably more of a in-person type meeting. The question that becomes is we may be post-COVID in the sense of the emergency that we currently have, but yet it could swing the other way real fast. And I think that's where Chris is getting at. How do we create flexibility going forward? But I think the closed session is a point of topic that the board will want to figure out long-term with using virtual conferencing.
Agreed.
And Paul, I think you hinted at this, but my hope is that if we get this policy right, it'll really help the community, because if we have a good board member candidate of the future, whoever that may be, who could attend many in-person sessions, but for some reason is not able to be physically present at all of them, and we would appreciate their talents on the board, would we not want them to run because of a policy? I wouldn't want to necessarily handicap us either. So I guess I'm thinking of it primarily because of the COVID situation and some of the flexibility, and we don't know what the future is going to hold. But I don't want to limit our board membership or candidates of the future because of some way we're artificially handicapping ourselves today.
Joel, maybe you remember this, but I believe at one point in time our virtual attendance policy said you could only do that so many times a year. And so it would handcuff if Joel was traveling 6 of the 12 months for work. I don't believe he could have been an active member of the board meeting that policy.
That's right. I think we revised it, if I'm looking at the date, in February of 2019. That was in a revision, was we took out, it talked about the number of times, that you could call in a calendar year. And we at the time decided that, we'd rather have you on the phone or virtually than not call in at all, so. If we're going to take a look at the policy, I mean, if you look at the numbers down at the bottom, point number 1, notice must be given at least noon the day of the meeting. Well, nobody gave me any, I'm not the president of the board anymore, I'm the chair of this committee though, but nobody gave me notice that we were going to call in virtually. I think that was just a given. And then point number 3 is notice must be given to the community at the beginning of the board meeting. Well, we posted this meeting saying that it was going to be a virtual meeting. I think that's a given as well. So I would clean some of that up if we're gonna take a look at reviewing some things in this policy. Before COVID, I think the policy, when it came to play or when it was adopted in 2012 was kind of a, let's utilize technology. We'd rather have you call into a meeting than completely miss a meeting because you're out of town for work or something. However, if you're in town, you're expected to be in person in the boardroom, sitting behind the microphone. And I think that's why there were limits to the number of times you could call in. I don't think anyone was taking advantage of that and literally sitting at home because they didn't want to comb their hair and show up at a board meeting. But the way we've been conducting these meetings the past 2 months has been pretty effective, and as long as we allow public participation at our regular board meetings, I'm fine with kind of relaxing the policy and
I think
technology.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Laura.
If I could comment on number 3, the one where it states notice is given to community members at the beginning of the meeting. Joel, there were a number of times when you were board president that at the start of the meeting you would state that this board member is participating via telephone tonight.
Correct.
And you would state that very eloquently. But it also it served that purpose of notifying the public that that person was participating. And I feel as though, then it always encouraged, everybody knew when we were doing the roll call count that we were, waiting to be able to hear and acknowledge that person. So that one's not a formal, announcement in the paper or posting. That is just as simply done as you had done that in the past. Yeah. So I was just pointing that out. You've done it very well and very simply.
I like the fact that, COVID notwithstanding, we have the ability to be able to come in remotely because, yeah, a lot of us are in mobile work situations, and I've got a periodic, or I've had periodic sales conference conflicts and so forth. But I come back to Tim's comments on the closed session piece, and yeah, given that we, for the moment, are out of heavy closed session activity, I would want to reconsider what we do there. And I think if we have, let's go to the extreme and say we pull closed session out of the scope of what we can come in and do virtually, and we have a flare up at some point down the road, COVID or whatever else. I think just as we did this time around, we could probably fast track something if the situation needed a closed session to be able to get us back into a position where we could act on that. But I think in the spirit of confidentiality and the general nature of a closed session, I think we should make it truly closed.
Paul, with that, would you put in the policy, I wonder, like I think we've had to do the special board meeting request to change a board meeting over there. Would you want something in the policy that would explicitly state that if we needed to have a closed session of the board virtually, this is the process? A board member makes a request to the board president. It's a response by every board member like that, or would you rather fast track the policy change every single time?
I think having it lined out in the policy gives us a point of reference so that people remember, and there's a process. Whereas if this happens 2 years from now and we go the fast track route, people have short memories. And why are they doing this with a sense of urgency? What happened? And they'll forget what took place 24 months prior. So I think having it lined out in a policy is a bit more informative for the community and protective of the board, if that makes sense.
Okay. And we can certainly look at language for that and outline that in a way that would basically involve every single board member in an approval process. So if somebody came back and said, did Chris agree to that, we could put that right in there.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, Chris, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm in favor of tweaking the language. I think it makes sense to relax this appropriately. Paul, I agree. I think we need to address closed sessions in a responsible way. So I'd be up for considering revised wording on this.
I'm going to agree with what Chris just said. I'd really like to revisit the extenuating circumstances, because even if we're not worried about the board members' help, maybe they're in a situation where they're caring for someone at home that they don't want to go out. So I'd like to really look at that piece again.
Yeah, the piece that I wrestle with, and I appreciate taking the numerical, the frequency count out earlier, but other than the definition of extenuating, there's nothing in here that would prohibit me from vacationing in Florida for 4 months over winter and dialing in for the board meetings. But I don't know that, I don't feel that I'd be effective, or a board member would be effective in that role, because they're not in the community for 4 months, and that's not the spirit of the position. But the policy doesn't out and out prohibit that either for things absent closed sessions potentially.
Yeah. Paul, one thing I kind of come back to, if you did that first of all, congratulations if you can go to Florida for 4 months. But if you did that and ran for re-election to the school board, well, then it's ultimately up to the people we serve to say, you know what, I don't like the fact that Paul Fisher lives in Florida for 4 months and calls into the school board meetings all the time. He's never here. And so then you wouldn't be re-elected, you know, and so,
Right.
you know, so I kind of come back to that. And you know, ultimately you got to kind of answer to the people you serve. And if you're calling in all the time and people start calling and writing emails mad about it, then you got to defend yourself.
Yeah, and I agree that there's a level of personal accountability in that you know what, my circumstances have changed and I need to resign from my position. Do the right thing.
Yeah. I think in addition, I agree with both of your points. If it turned out that we had a board member or two who was, you know, just terribly abusing the policy, we can change the policy. So, you know, that's another remedy. And so I think, you know, just like at our companies, you know, we have policies maybe not exactly like this, but they ebb and flow and change based on circumstances at that time. And so I think we've proven that this virtual attendance can be effective. Seems that we've got board members that you know, respect attendance requirements. And so I don't know that we need a terribly heavy-handed board policy around it. I think, you know, flexibility makes sense under these circumstances to prepare for, you know, what could be some interesting times ahead. So I'm glad we're looking at this, and I'm pleased the policy committee supports, you know, taking a second look at it.
So taking a shot at a revision on this, Tim and Laura, is that something that one of you two want to spearhead, or is that something you're looking at a board member spearheading?
I can certainly take a shot at it. I wouldn't mind having a board member to look at it through their eyes. You know, like I want to go pull some of the most recent stuff from WSAB, some other, you know, districts and that. But it would be nice to have the board member's perspective also at the same time. So if there is somebody who'd love to volunteer that I could email back and forth with, I'd be fine taking that on.
Yeah, and I'm fine if you want to bounce ideas off of me. I'm sure the other three on the phone here, Aaron, Paul, Chris would be happy to do it as well. So don't be shy about sending it to board members.
I think that's a really efficient way to collaborate on it, and I think that would be best.
Yeah.
Looking at it.
I talked to a board president back in March about how they were conducting their virtual meetings, and I want to say she was in, it wasn't New Berlin, it was, I can't think of the district, just down in Waukesha somewhere. But anyway, I'm sure there's a ton of other policies out there we can take a peek at and see what other districts are doing. So,
sure. Does the committee have a time frame they want this back? I know we're going to have a policy committee on June 1st. Only I know that off the top of my head because I have some policies coming on that one. Do we want it back for that, or do we want to take our time and do due diligence? Is that urgent of a rush? Just some feedback on that.
You know, I don't anticipate we're going to have board meetings in person. Well, we certainly won't through the end of June. You know, technically schools and buildings are supposed to be closed anyway, so I don't know.
I think next board meeting is scheduled for, it's optional for people who want to come in person, but we'll continue to do it virtual so we can do it in a hybrid way. I talked with the superintendent. He had mentioned that although through the end of the year, the end of June, that doesn't apply technically to school board meetings. Oh, but we want to be responsible. We want to be responsible at the same time.
We did get the email today about that.
Yeah, this is Don, and that is accurate. Even though schools are closed for school purposes, there is a provision, even with the safer at home provisions, it did allow for school board meetings if they wanted to be face-to-face. And so I think we'll have the ability to have an in-person board meeting for those who would like to attend. The rest can call in. We're going to set up the boardroom. We think we could have up to 20 people in attendance at the board meeting and still do social distancing. And so we'll have that information available next week.
Okay, I stand corrected. That's good.
Yeah.
Tim, we've got the audio issues resolved with having multiple people there.
Yeah, I think, so part of the reason Jen sent the email today is I asked for it. It is dependent upon how many of you are in person versus how many of you are in virtually, and how we would set that up. Like if I was gonna do it like I did last time where it was just you and Chris in that boardroom, we would have had one laptop, put you 6 feet apart, had it further back or something along those lines. It's then how do I get the feed of if it's Joe, and I'm looking at my screen, Laura, Joel, and Aaron are virtual that day. How do I get that feed to City TV? And John and I have emailed back a little bit, and that's really what we want to figure out. It's hard to have multiple people on a video conference in the same room. I don't care if you're 12 feet apart, 18 feet apart. There's just that, Paul doesn't turn his mic off as fast as I get mine on. That becomes an issue. So we would, in an in-person meeting, ideally, we would go back to kind of how we used to do it. If Joel called in, or sometimes Tani would join us on a video, depending upon where she was traveling, we would have that computer be for that one person. It just depends how many board members want to be gone. But as soon as we come in person, we're using the cameras in the boardroom and doing it, I call it the old school way of running it through community TV that way.
Yeah, okay. Well, to come back to your question of timing, as the guy who asked to bring this back through committee, I would prefer that we get it right rather than we get it fast. And my whole intent in asking to bring it back through was because we were fast tracking it under duress, if you will. And I just wanted to, take a more tempered stroll through things. And whether we do that early June, later June, I'm fine.
Okay. All right, then I will start on something in the next couple of weeks and get it out to you for feedback, and we can comment back and forth and so forth once I get some different pieces from other places and take a shot at it. So
Great.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Our last topic is the calendar as far as policy reviews and scheduling what we're going to be looking at here in the next 12 months. So.
Yeah. So we did it during the course of this school year. We intended to revise all of the 300 policies. We did not quite finish that. And we have a few other policies outside the 300 that really are a little more urgent to address. So the recommendation is to address those urgent ones, and anything we need revised for the start of the school year at the next board meeting. Then when Jen Wimmer is back on board, or is on board, excuse me, we'll revise the policy schedule and come for the July policy meeting. If there's going to be one at the July board meeting, then if we have policy at that time, we would set the schedule for the year with the policy committee. Does that make sense to the group?
Makes sense to me.
Agreed.
Agreed.
All right. So we have a document that was started a few years back that has the policy schedule on and is compliant with the board. We have a board policy on having a policy schedule. And so we have that schedule, and that's the one we'll use for the revision then, in order to make the plan for this next school year. But I would suggest that we take a minute to talk about policy 171, and if the board would, members on team would want to review that at the June 1st policy committee meeting. It's a 100 series, which is the board policies about board operations. And specifically the section, we did revise this, I believe, in 2019. But one area that we didn't revise that we did have some discussion on was about the posting of our board agendas in every school building. we've continued to do that, and during this time, we have, that meant sometimes people were running out. If there was a small revision, once it was posted, people were running out to multiple buildings to rehang them. And in this time, when our buildings have been shut down, that's fallen on a few people to run out and do that, and get to all of the buildings by the designated time. We are not required to post it in every one of our school buildings. And that was something we had talked about earlier, was having the policy state the required areas where it would be posted, and then, if possible, in all school buildings. I would recommend that the board consider this at the next policy meeting, and really to kind of focus in on that area. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that's fine. Let's bring it to the next policy meeting and talk about it for sure.
Agreed.
Okay. So
And Laura, if you're looking for feedback on the policy itself, I don't think we can do that right here, right now, because it wasn't on the agenda. But again, feel free to call us or email us individually if you're looking for feedback on that.
will do.
Okay.
Mr. Kierkegaard, did you want to speak about that?
I did. Just two things. One is, I think you want to, and so we can bring it back to the next policy meeting. Bottom line is you want to continue the practice of posting it everywhere we're already posting it. It's just that if it doesn't absolutely accidentally get posted at Rolf's, we don't want to be out of compliance because it got tore down or it got whatever. And so, but I think it's a better discussion once it's on the agenda. The other topic that I'd like just a point of clarification. When I said board meetings can take place, that was right in the statute, right in the safer at home provisions, the closing of schools, that school board meetings and essential government functions could take place. That's not the same as extracurricular activities in schools. It's specifically to the governing of the schools. And that's why we can have a face-to-face school board meeting on June 1st and can't have some other extracurricular activities. I just wanted a point of clarification.
Very good. Well, we're at the end of our agenda. Is there anything else for the good of the policy committee here?
Nothing here.
Nothing there.
Okay. Tim and Laura and Don, Jennifer, thank you very much. And Aaron, Paul, Chris, thank you. Thank you, Paul and Chris, for agreeing to serve on this committee. If for whatever reason you decide you don't want to serve on the committee, just let me know and we'll find a replacement for you. But it can be kind of fun. You know, this committee is you're setting, it's kind of a working committee, kind of setting what the policy is going to look like before it comes to the board. And so, and of course, Aaron, anytime you and any other board members are welcome to call in and participate in this meeting as well. So with that, I will adjourn the policy meeting. Thank you.